AP Environmental Science students. In today's screencast, we're going to start Chapter 2, which goes over science, matter, energy, and systems. All of today's notes are from Living in the Environment, the 16th edition, by Miller and Spoolman. So Chapter 2, Section 1 is all about science. The main idea here is that scientists collect data and develop theories, models, and laws about how nature works. Our textbook's definition of science is that science is an endeavor to discover how nature works and to use that knowledge to make predictions about what is likely to happen in nature. So, as we've been taught growing up, as you've gone through your science classes in school, we've learned about the scientific method. So, it's a prescribed list of steps that scientists go through in order to come up with some sort of results and draw some conclusions. So the first step is to identify a problem. The second step is to find out what's already known about the problem. It doesn't make sense to study something that's already been studied. Our third step is to ask a question to be investigated and narrow down what you're actually testing. Number 4 is to gather some preliminary data. Once you have that data, you make a hypothesis about what you expect to happen. There's also something called a null hypothesis, which states that the independent variable has no effect on the dependent variable. So if you look at this picture I have over here, an example of a null hypothesis is here. So if the question we're initially asking is, where have all my socks gone? Your hypothesis might be extraterrestrial beings have transported themselves into my house in order to steal my socks. The null hypothesis would basically be the opposite of that, saying that aliens are not to blame, there is some other explanation for the disappearing socks. The sixth step is to make some testable predictions. Seventh step is to test your predictions with experiments, models, and observations. So one of the things you're going to see a lot, especially in environmental science, is that doing an experiment out in nature isn't really controlled. We can't do it, or it's too big that it's not feasible for us to actually do a test on the entire Earth's wind patterns. So instead we use a model. And a model is an approximate representation or a simulation of systems being studied. So think the weather. When you watch the simulations on TV with the news about what they expect to happen, the forecast for the next couple of days, that's a model. It's a simulation of a system that they're studying, and they're giving you predictions about what they think is going to happen in the next couple of days. Our last step is to accept or reject the hypothesis, and if enough data has been collected, draw some sort of conclusion. When a hypothesis is accepted, sometimes, if it's accepted by enough people, it can become scientific theory. And scientific theory is a well-tested and highly accepted hypothesis. The only way things can become scientific theory is after it's gone through vigorous peer review. And peer review is when scientists examine and critique the validity of work done by other scientists. Generally, in the science field, if something hasn't been peer reviewed, it's not considered sound science. In order to come up with some sort of conclusions or analyze their results, scientists have to use reasoning, imagination, and creativity to kind of figure things out and put the pieces of the puzzle together. So there's two types of reasoning. The first type is inductive reasoning, and that involves using specific observation and measurements to arrive at a general conclusion or hypothesis. So when you think of science, this is usually what you think of. You start with specific observations and you put them together like a puzzle to come up with a general idea. So, for example, our lab we just did with the Hickory Creek at Pilcher Park, we're looking at a bunch of different pieces to the puzzle. We're looking at your site survey, your MBI, your site sketch, and putting that all together to come up with a general statement about the health of the creek. So when we do that, it's called bottom-up reasoning, where we go from very specific pieces of information to a general statement. Deductive reasoning is kind of the opposite, and that's where you're using logic to arrive at a specific conclusion based on a generalization first. So this is more top-down, And like I said, you go from general to specific. So something general you might think would be all birds have feathers. So then you would look at a specific example. Let's say you look at an eagle and you say, oh, this eagle has feathers too. And therefore, you can say eagles are birds because they have feathers. So you're going top down, starting general, going specific. The most important results of science are theories and laws. So theories we have already kind of talked about, and it's well-tested and highly accepted hypothesis. With theory, it's always supported by extensive evidence, and it's not to be taken lightly. So a lot of times when you hear the word theory, like in everyday conversation, you're theorizing something. It's usually kind of out of thin air. There's not a lot of evidence, but that's actually the complete opposite of what a scientific theory is. Theory is generally accepted as true. So an example of scientific theory is the cell theory, that all living things are made up of cells. Pretty much everybody on this planet believes that all living things are made up of cells. We don't really question that, but it is still a scientific theory. A scientific law, or a law of nature, is a well-tested and highly accepted description of what we find happening again and again. So there is no proof or observations made that could contradict scientific law. So the law of gravity is a good example. Lastly, sometimes, and this is fairly rare, but sometimes we have a paradigm shift where new discoveries overthrow a previously accepted theory. So that would be like if something was discovered that we said was alive, but it was made up of something other than cells. So that would be a paradigm shift. Results of science can be tentative, reliable, or unreliable. So tentative or frontier science are preliminary results that have not been widely tested or peer-reviewed. At this stage, it's normal for scientists to disagree with the meaning or accuracy of the data. So think about a lot of things that you hear on the news that are like, scientists newly discovered that there's this cure for this disease, and then you never hear about it again. And usually it gets in the news very quickly because people are excited about it, but once it becomes peer-reviewed or it's more widely tested, they realize it's not what they initially thought. Reliable science are data, hypotheses, theories, and laws that are widely accepted by scientists, and they're considered experts in their field. And unreliable science is scientific hypotheses and results that have been discarded because it hasn't undergone peer review, or after peer review, its results were deemed untrue, or the actual procedure of the experiment was not controlled, or there was some issue with it. So, there are 5 major limitations of environmental science. So first, scientists cannot prove anything. Instead, they try to establish that a particular hypothesis, theory, or law has a high probability of being true. We can't ever say that everything is 100% proven, because we can't do that. We are very limited to our knowledge and our experience on Earth. Number 2, scientists are human and cannot be expected to be totally free of bias, but bias can be minimized by peer review. 3, statistical methods may be used to estimate very large or very small numbers. Like I was saying, we can't necessarily study wind patterns because it's too big. We can't count every single fish in a lake or in the ocean because we just can't do that. It's not feasible. So we use statistical methods like probability or statistics to figure that out. Fourthly, environmental phenomena involve interacting variables and complex interactions, which makes it difficult and too costly to test one variable in a controlled environment. So again, we use these models, we use simulations to kind of mimic those tests. And lastly, the scientific process is limited to understanding the natural world and can't be used to answer moral or ethical questions. So if you remember Unit 1, a lot of it was a lot of opinion, about like cultural carrying capacity. We can't test that. We can't figure that out. It's not something that we can actually run through with a scientific method. So it's very limited to understanding the natural world.